The Discovery. 26th of May, 1946. Pearl Harbor, Territory of Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, United States Navy Intelligence, sat at his desk in the windowless room of the Pacific Fleet Headquarters, turning over a yellowed casualty report from His Majesty's Indian Army. The document had arrived 3 days earlier from London, part of a larger exchange of wartime records between Allied powers, now beginning the long work of accounting for their dead. Harrison had been reviewing Japanese transport sinkings, cross-referencing them against American submarine patrol reports. A tedious but necessary task in the great reckoning that followed victory. This particular document listed 16 names from the 16th Punjab Regiment, all marked as Lost at Sea, Probable Japanese Action, dated January 26, 1943. The coordinates placed them in the Caroline Islands, and the associated transport was identified as the Buyo Maru. Harrison felt his stomach tighten. He knew that name. He reached for the patrol report file, his hands suddenly unsteady, and pulled the USS Wahoo Action Summary from January 1943. There it was. Buyo Maru, sunk by torpedoes on January 26th. Commanding Officer, Lieutenant Commander Dudley W. Morton. The report was marked Commendatory Action, and Morton had received a Navy Cross for this patrol. Harrison read the brief description of the engagement. Enemy transport destroyed. Survivors in lifeboats engaged after opening fire on submarine. The phrasing was clinical, proper, justified. But if the Indian soldiers died when the Buyo Maru went down, why were they listed as lost at sea rather than killed in action aboard enemy transport? Harrison's mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. They must have gotten the dates wrong, he said aloud to the empty room, though his voice carried no conviction. What Lieutenant Commander Harrison didn't know was that he had just stumbled onto the event that would force the Navy to confront the most uncomfortable truth about its most celebrated submarine commander, and about the nature of the war they had fought beneath the Pacific. The scale of reality. The mathematics were staggering in their implication. USS Wahoo, under Dudley Morton's command, had conducted 4 war patrols between January and October of 1943, a span of just 10 months. In that time, Morton claimed 19 ships sunk, totaling 55,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. By comparison, the average American submarine in the Pacific sank approximately 4 ships during its entire wartime service. Morton's rate of destruction was nearly 5 times the average, compressed into less than a year. His first patrol under command had produced 6 confirmed kills. His second patrol, the one that included the Buyo Maru incident, added 8 more. The numbers had made Morton the most celebrated submarine commander in the Pacific Fleet, his photograph in newspapers across America, his tactics studied and emulated by every submarine officer in the Navy. But there were other numbers now, ones that Harrison was beginning to calculate with growing dread. The Buyo Maru had been carrying, according to Japanese transport manifests that Harrison now pulled from another file, approximately 2,000 passengers. Of these, roughly 1,800 were Japanese soldiers and sailors being repatriated from New Guinea. The other 200 were Allied prisoners of war, 98 Indian soldiers from the 16th Punjab Regiment, captured at Singapore in February 1942, 62 Australian infantrymen from the same battle. 20 British merchant seamen captured when their vessels were taken in the Java Sea, and 14 Dutch colonial troops from the East Indies. All of them had survived the sinking of the transport. According to Japanese records that American forces had captured after the occupation began, 126 prisoners had been rescued from the water by Japanese vessels that arrived several hours after the attack. The mathematics were simple and terrible. 74 Allied prisoners of war had died, not when the Buyo Maru went down, but afterward, in the water or in the lifeboats. Background. The making of Mushmouth Mush. Dudley Walker Morton had been born in Owensboro, Kentucky, on July 17, 1907, in the last quiet summer before the world began its long march toward the wars that would define the 20th century. He was the son of a riverboat captain, a detail that would later seem prophetic to those who knew his career. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis, he had been an indifferent student academically, graduating in 1930 without particular distinction. But he possessed two qualities that would serve him well in the submarine service. He was utterly fearless, and he had an instinct for aggressive action that bordered on recklessness. His classmates had nicknamed him Mushmouth, after a cartoon character whose prominent jaw resembled Morton's own square features. The name was later shortened to Mush, and it stuck, becoming the identifier by which he would be known throughout the fleet. The Dudley Morton who emerged from Annapolis in 1930 entered a Navy that still fought, at least in theory, according to the old rules. The Hague Convention of 1907, to which the United States was a signatory, was explicit about the treatment of survivors at sea. Article 12 stated clearly that belligerents had a duty to rescue the crews of vessels they destroyed, provided this could be done without danger to their own ship. Even in wartime, there were supposed to be limits, civilized boundaries that separated legitimate military action from murder. Submarine commanders were taught that they could sink enemy vessels, but they were to give warning when possible and make provision for survivors. It was the tradition of the sea, older than nations, the understanding that all men who ventured onto the ocean were subject to its merciless power and owed each other the duty of rescue. This was the doctrine that shaped Morton's early career. Between 1930 and 1942, he served aboard USS Saratoga, USS Chicago, USS Canopus, USS Fairfax, USS S-37, and USS R-5, moving through the ranks with steady, if unspectacular, progress. He was regarded as competent, aggressive, popular with his crews, but sometimes difficult with his superiors. He had strong opinions about tactics and was not shy about expressing them. In October 1942, while in nominal command of USS Dolphin, which was under repairs at Pearl Harbor, he was promoted to lieutenant commander. His real opportunity came in November of that year, when he was designated prospective commanding officer of USS Wahoo, a Gato-class submarine then completing a refit in Brisbane, Australia. He officially took command on December 31st, 1942, as the year turned and the Pacific War entered its second brutal cycle. The first revelation, Harrison spent the next week in archives, pulling every document related to the Wahoo's second patrol. What he found first were the official reports, all of which told the same story Morton had given. The Buyo Maru had been torpedoed and sunk. Survivors in lifeboats had opened fire on the surface submarine with rifles and machine guns. USS Wahoo had returned fire in self-defense. The action was justified under the rules of engagement. The reports had been reviewed and approved by Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific submarines, who had added a personal commendation. Lieutenant Commander Morton demonstrated aggressive spirit and sound tactical judgment, Lockwood had written. The Navy Cross recommendation had gone through without objection. But Harrison had learned, in 3 years of intelligence work, to look beyond the official narrative. He began pulling crew statements, not the formal after-action reports, but the casual letters home, the interviews conducted for hometown newspapers, the oral histories that the Navy had begun collecting from submarine veterans. In a box labeled Wahoo Crew Correspondence, 1942 to 1943, he found a letter from Seaman First Class Victor Marino of Brooklyn, New York, written to his sister on February 4, 1943, 9 days after the Buyomaru incident. The letter was remarkable for what it didn't say. Marino described the patrol in general terms, mentioned that they had gotten a big transport. Noted that the skipper is really taking the fight to them. But then there was a paragraph that Harrison read 3 times. We saw something after that I don't think I can write about. The Japs did something. Our guys did something. I don't know what I mean. I keep seeing faces in Maon, the water. I know they were the enemy, sis. But some of them looked so young. The skipper said they shot at us first. Maybe they did. I was down in the engine room, so I didn't see that part. But I saw the after part, when we were on the surface. I keep thinking about it. Harrison pulled more letters. Torpedoman's mate 2nd class, George Grider, from Memphis, Tennessee, had written to his wife on February 8th. This war is not what I thought it would be. We are killing them, and I know that's our job. But killing them in the water is different from killing them on their ship. The XO, Mr. O'Kane, he was up top with the skipper during the whole thing. He didn't say much about it afterward, just told us we did our duty. But his hands were shaking when he came down from the bridge. The pattern emerges. The executive officer, Richard O'Kane, Morton's second-in-command on the Wahoo. Harrison knew that name too. O'Kane had gone on to command his own submarine, USS Tang, and had become one of the most decorated officers in the submarine service before his boat was lost in October 1944. O'Kane had survived, had been captured by the Japanese, and had spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He was alive now, back in the United States, recovering from his captivity. Harrison made a note to request an interview, though he suspected that particular conversation would not be easy for either of them. Meanwhile, he continued through the files. Another letter, this one from Lieutenant Junior Grade Roger Payne, the Wahoo's communications officer, written to his parents on February 10th. I am writing this to you because I need to tell someone, and I can't tell the Navy doctors because it might affect my fitness for duty. I have not been sleeping well since the last patrol. I keep hearing sounds in my head, voices calling out in the water. I was on the bridge during the surface action against the transport survivors. The captain gave the order to fire. I understand why he did it. They had shot at us first, or so we believed, but there were so many of them, Dad. 20 lifeboats full of men. We went up and down the line. It took almost an hour. Some of them were waving white flags by the end. The captain said they were trying to trick us. The Japanese soldiers don't surrender. Maybe he was right. But I can't stop seeing it. 20 lifeboats. Harrison did the mathematics. A standard Japanese lifeboat held approximately 30 men. 20 boats meant 600 people in the water, more or less. The official report mentioned numerous survivors engaged in hostile action. It did not mention an hour of sustained fire. It did not mention white flags. Harrison pulled the deck log, the minute-by-minute record of the ship's activities. For January 26, 1943, the log showed 0830. Torpedoed enemy transport, 2 hits observed, 0845. Target sinking, 0900. Surfaced to observe, 0915. Received small arms fire from survivors in lifeboats. 0920. Returned fire. 1030. Secured from action stations. Commenced patrol. 1 hour and 10 minutes. The deck log confirmed what Lieutenant Payne had written. This had not been a brief exchange of fire. This had been a systematic action conducted over more than an hour against survivors in lifeboats. The scale becomes clear. Harrison requested the gun crew reports, the detailed accounting of ammunition expended during the action. What came back from the archives made his hands go cold. USS Wahoo mounted a 4-inch deck gun forward, a 40-millimeter gun aft, and 2 twin-mount 20-millimeter guns during the action on January 26th. According to the ammunition logs, the submarine had fired 78 rounds of 4-inch shells, 640 rounds of 40-millimeter, and approximately 4,000 rounds of 20-millimeter ammunition, 4,000 rounds, into lifeboats. Over 70 minutes, he calculated the rate of fire, approximately 57 rounds per minute, sustained for over an hour. The 20-millimeter guns could fire at 250 rounds per minute each when fully engaged, which meant the gunners had been firing in controlled bursts, taking time to aim, selecting targets. This was not panic fire or suppressive fire. This was deliberate execution. Harrison pulled the gunnery reports from other Wahoo patrols for comparison. During her first patrol, Wahoo had expended 120 rounds of 4-inch ammunition across 3 surface engagements with armed enemy vessels. During her third patrol, she had fired 94 rounds during 2 engagements. The expenditure on January 26th was not just high, it was unprecedented in the boat's history. You didn't fire 78 rounds of 4-inch shells at riflemen in lifeboats. You fired that many rounds at an enemy destroyer or patrol boat, a vessel that could fight back meaningfully, that posed a genuine threat. The paradigm shatters. The next document Harrison found was a statement from Ensign Jack Griggs, the Wahoo's junior officer of the deck, dated February 16, 1943, marked restricted, and filed with the Submarine Force Chaplain's office. Harrison had to request special authorization to access it, and when it arrived, he understood why it had been buried. Griggs wrote, "I am making this statement to Chaplain Davies because I need someone to hear this, and I cannot speak of it to my fellow officers. I was on the bridge during the entire action against the Buyo Maru survivors on January 26th. The captain's version of events, as presented in the official report, is not complete. The survivors did have weapons. I saw rifles and what appeared to be light machine guns in several boats. I believe I saw muzzle flashes from at least 3 boats, though I cannot be certain they were aimed at us rather than fired in distress. The captain ordered us to return fire. This I understood and accepted as necessary. What I did not expect was the duration and intensity of what followed. We did not fire a warning burst and then withdraw. We did not disable the boats and leave. We went down the line of lifeboats, one by one, and we fired into each until there was no more movement visible. I was handed binoculars and told to spot targets. I saw men, Captain. I saw their faces. Some were in uniform, yes. Japanese soldiers, as we reported. But some were in other clothes, darker uniforms that I did not recognize. Some had white skin, not Japanese. I reported this to the XO, Mr. O'Kane. He told me to maintain my watch and stay quiet. The captain heard the exchange. He said, "If they're on a Jap transport, they're enemy." He said it loud enough for the whole bridge crew to hear. He said, "This is war, gentlemen. We show mercy and we die." When it was over, we submerged and withdrew. The captain came below and congratulated the gun crews. He said they had destroyed the enemy and protected the boat. He said the men in those boats would have been rescued by Japanese ships and would have fought against us another day. He said we had saved American lives by taking theirs. Perhaps he was right. I do not know. But I know that some of the men in those boats were waving white undershirts. I know that some of them jumped into the water and tried to swim away from the boats that were being targeted. I know that we chased them down anyway. I know that at the end, there were only bodies floating in the water and wreckage and blood. The water was red for 100 yards. I know that when we dove, I went to my quarters and vomited until there was nothing left in me. I have not told anyone this. I am telling you now because I cannot carry it alone anymore." Harrison sat for a long time after reading that statement. Then he pulled out another file he had requested. Japanese records, translated after the war, of the ships that had responded to the Buyo Maru's distress call. The destroyer Harusame had arrived at the scene at approximately 12:30 on January 26th, 3 hours after the attack. The ship's log, in the code language of naval documentation, reported, "Found wreckage and survivors. Rescued 126 prisoners of war, 62 British Empire forces, 38 Japanese Army soldiers, 26 Japanese Navy personnel. Survivors reported submarine attack on lifeboats by American vessel. Prisoners report firing by submarine on boats attempting to display surrender flags. Survivors in severe distress, many wounded. Recovered 94 bodies, 74 prisoners of war, 20 Japanese military. Condition of bodies consistent with heavy machine gun fire. Further search suspended due to threat of submarine attack. 74 dead Allied prisoners, not killed when the transport went down. Killed afterward in the water, in the lifeboats by American guns, under orders from an American commander who would become one of the most celebrated heroes of the submarine war. The human dimension. Harrison obtained authorization to access British records from Singapore, where the prisoners from Buyo Maru had been captured in February 1942. He learned their names, their ages, their histories. Private Harjit Singh, 16th Punjab Regiment, age 22, from Amritsar. Captured at the fall of Singapore. Survived 11 months of captivity in Changi Prison. Killed in the water off the Caroline Islands by fire from USS Wahoo. Corporal David McLean, 18th Division, Australian Army, age 28, from Brisbane. Farmer before the war. Survived Singapore. Survived the transport torpedoing. Last seen alive in a lifeboat, according to survivors. Trying to wave a white shirt when the submarine came back around for another pass. Merchant Seaman Thomas Harrington, British steamship SS Empire Star, age 35, from Liverpool. Father of 3. Captured when his ship was taken in the Java Sea in March 1942. Killed January 26, 1943. The lists went on. Each name had a story, a life reduced now to a service record and a casualty notation. Harrison requested photographs from the British Army archives. They sent him a service photo of Private Singh, taken when he enlisted in 1940. He was smiling in the picture, proud in his new uniform, young and strong and alive. Harrison looked at that photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the young man's face with the image of a body floating in the Pacific, killed by American fire while trying to survive on a Japanese transport. He found more survivors' statements, taken by the Japanese during the brief interrogations that followed rescue. These had been captured at the end of the war and translated in 1946, part of the vast documentary haul that American intelligence was still processing. Lance Corporal William Hughes, 2nd Battalion, 16th Punjab Regiment, survivor, stated, "The submarine torpedoed the transport in the early morning. We had time to abandon ship. I was in the 4th lifeboat. We could see the submarine on the surface, close by. We thought perhaps they would take some prisoners, officers maybe, for intelligence. Then they opened fire on the first boat. We did not understand at first. Someone said the Japanese soldiers in Boat 1 had rifles. Maybe they shot at the submarine. We had no weapons. We were prisoners. We raised our hands. We waved white cloths. The submarine came down the line. They fired on Boat 2, then Boat 3. When they reached us, we jumped into the water. Some of us swam. Many couldn't swim. I went under and held my breath. I felt the bullets hitting the water above me. When I surfaced, the submarine was gone. The boat was sinking. Half the men were dead. The water was full of bodies. I floated for 3 hours before the Japanese destroyer came. Of the 38 men who were in my boat, 9 survived. I was one of them. I think about the others every day. The progressive confrontation. Harrison assembled a timeline, working backward from the known facts. On January 26, 1943, at approximately 0830 hours, USS Wahoo torpedoed the Japanese transport Buyo Maru, approximately 300 miles southwest of the Caroline Islands. The transport was carrying 1,800 Japanese military personnel and 200 Allied prisoners of war being transferred to Japan for labor assignments. The ship sank in approximately 15 minutes. Most personnel successfully abandoned ship in lifeboats. By 0900 hours, the submarine had surfaced and approached the survivors. Between 0915 and 1030 hours, the submarine engaged the lifeboats with gunfire, expending substantial ammunition. Approximately 74 Allied prisoners of war were killed in this action, along with an estimated 300 to 400 Japanese personnel. The submarine withdrew. 3 hours later, Japanese naval vessels arrived and rescued survivors. On February 3, 1943, USS Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor from her second war patrol. Lieutenant Commander Morton filed his patrol report, claiming 8 enemy vessels sunk, including the Buyo Maru. The report mentioned engagement with survivors who opened fire on submarine and stated that return fire was necessary to protect the vessel. The report was approved by Admiral Lockwood without amendment. Morton was recommended for the Navy Cross. The crew received commendations for aggressive action. The patrol was classified as highly successful. On February 28, 1943, Japanese authorities in Tokyo filed a diplomatic protest through neutral Swiss channels, claiming that an American submarine had committed a war crime by firing on survivors and prisoners of war in lifeboats after sinking the Buyo Maru. The protest included testimony from survivors and documented the deaths of Allied prisoners. The United States Navy investigated the claim and rejected it, stating that Japanese military personnel in the lifeboats had fired on the submarine and that the American response was justified self-defense. The Navy pointed out that the presence of Allied prisoners had not been communicated to the submarine and that Morton had no way of knowing non-combatants were present. The protest was dismissed as enemy propaganda. But now Harrison had the pieces that the 1943 investigators either didn't have or didn't want to see. He had the crew statements showing that officers on the bridge had seen evidence of non-Japanese personnel. He had the ammunition expenditure records showing the sustained nature of the fire. He had the Japanese records documenting the survivors' statements. He had the casualty lists with the names and service records of the dead Allied prisoners. He had, most damning of all, Ensign Griggs's statement to the chaplain about white flags and chase downs and the water turning red. The psychological transformation. Harrison spent 4 sleepless nights reviewing the materials, checking and rechecking, trying to find some way that the official narrative could still hold. Perhaps the Japanese records were fabricated. But why would they fabricate records that showed their own soldiers had been killed? Perhaps the crew members who wrote letters about their distress were mistaken or traumatized by combat and couldn't be trusted. But their accounts all aligned, all told the same essential story, all described an action that went far beyond brief defensive fire. Perhaps the Allied prisoners were hit by accident, crossfire, Japanese bullets rather than American. But the Japanese destroyer's log was explicit about the nature of the wounds, and survivors' statements placed the fire coming from the submarine, not from within the lifeboats themselves. He went back to the beginning, to Morton's official report, and read it again with new understanding. The phrase, "survivors engaged in hostile action," covered what had actually been 20 lifeboats containing a mixture of armed Japanese soldiers, unarmed Japanese sailors, and Allied prisoners of war in various states of captivity. The phrase, "return fire" was necessary to protect the vessel, covered 78 rounds of 4-inch shells, 640 rounds of 40mm, and 4,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition fired over 70 minutes at targets in lifeboats. The phrase, "aggressive prosecution of the enemy," covered the methodical destruction of boats, the chasing down of swimmers, the disregard of white flags, and the killing of 74 Allied prisoners. Harrison found himself thinking about Morton, trying to understand the man who had given those orders. By all accounts, Dudley Morton was not a cruel person. His crew loved him. He was known for his concern with his men's welfare, his willingness to take risks to protect them, his fierce devotion to bringing them home alive. Letters from Wahoo crew members consistently described him as fair, brave, and inspiring. He was the best skipper in the Navy, Seaman Marino had written in a later letter. He taught us to fight, to be aggressive, to take the war to the enemy. He was fearless. He would never ask us to do something he wouldn't do himself. But something had happened on January 26, 1943, in the waters off the Caroline Islands. Morton had made a decision. He had seen lifeboats full of survivors, some of them possibly armed, some of them clearly not Japanese. And he had made the calculation that the risk they posed, or might pose if rescued, justified their destruction. He had given the order. His crew had obeyed. The guns had fired for over an hour. When it was over, hundreds of men were dead in the water, including dozens of Allied soldiers who had already survived one sinking, one battle, one capture, only to be killed by friendly fire while trying to survive their second sinking. The supporting evidence. Harrison continued to build his case, though he increasingly wondered what he would do with it. He found the original Naval Intelligence Assessment from April 1943, which had examined the Japanese diplomatic protest. The assessment concluded, "Claim is likely enemy propaganda designed to discredit American submarine operations. Lieutenant Commander Morton is a decorated officer with exemplary service record. No credible evidence suggests deliberate targeting of prisoners of war. Presence of Allied prisoners on Japanese transport was not known to submarine commander and does not affect legal status of attack on legitimate military target. Recommend no action." But attached to that assessment was a handwritten note from the intelligence officer who prepared it, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Mitchell. The note was addressed to his superior and marked, "Not for file." But someone had filed it anyway. "Sir, I should note for the record that I have reviewed crew statements from USS Wahoo, and some of them raise questions about the official account. However, pursuing this matter would damage morale in the submarine force at a critical moment in the war." Morton's record speaks for itself. The men killed were on an enemy vessel. The legal argument is sound, even if the moral situation is uncomfortable. Recommend we let this one rest. Harrison pulled everything he could find about Morton's subsequent career. After the Buyo Maru patrol, Morton had taken Wahoo out 2 more times. Third patrol, 4 confirmed sinks, 7,000 tons. Fourth patrol, 5 confirmed sinks, 12,000 tons. By October 1943, Morton's total stood at 19 ships, 55,000 tons. Numbers that made him the most successful submarine commander in the Pacific theater. He had been interviewed for magazines, filmed for newsreels, held up as a model for aggressive submarine warfare. Admiral Lockwood had written of him, "Morton has the killer instinct required for successful submarine command. He seeks out the enemy and destroys him without hesitation or mercy. This is what we need." In October 1943, Morton had taken Wahoo on her 5th war patrol into the Sea of Japan, one of the most dangerous patrol areas in the Pacific. It was a volunteer mission. Morton had pushed for the assignment. "I want to hit them where it hurts," he had told Lockwood. "I want to go into their backyard and show them they're not safe anywhere." Wahoo left Pearl Harbor on October 13th, 1943. She was expected back on November 30th. She did not return. On December 9th, she was declared overdue and presumed lost. 89 men were lost with her, including Morton and Richard O'Kane, who was still serving as his executive officer. Wait, no. Harrison checked his notes. O'Kane had not been on that patrol. O'Kane had been rotated off Wahoo after the 4th patrol to prepare for his own command. So O'Kane was alive. Morton and 88 others were dead. The fate of Wahoo. After the war, American investigators had searched Japanese records for information about lost submarines. In July 1946, they found the answer about Wahoo. On October 11th, 1943, a Japanese anti-submarine aircraft had spotted a submarine running on the surface in Soya Strait, the narrow passage between Hokkaido Island and Sakhalin Island. The aircraft, a Type 97 carrier attack bomber, had attacked immediately, dropping 3 depth charges. The submarine had crash-dived, but the charges had been well placed. The aircraft crew reported a large oil slick and debris field afterward. Japanese destroyer Takeo had investigated later that day and confirmed the sinking, reporting, "Submarine destroyed, oil and wreckage observed, no survivors." The location was logged precisely. 45 degrees 32 minutes north, 142 degrees 12 minutes east. Harrison looked at a map. Soya Strait was a bottleneck, one of the most heavily patrolled and defended waterways in the Japanese defensive perimeter. Submarines that penetrated the Sea of Japan had to either exit through Soya Strait or the even more dangerous Tsushima Strait to the south. Morton had chosen Soya, possibly because it was the most direct route home, possibly because he believed he could run the strait on the surface at high speed before Japanese forces could react. He had been wrong. The patrol aircraft had found him. The depth charges had killed him and his entire crew. Wahoo had been destroyed approximately 150 miles from open ocean, from safety, from home. She had penetrated the enemy's defenses, carried out her mission, sunk at least 2 more ships according to Japanese records Harrison had found, and had almost made it out. Almost. Morton died the way he lived, Admiral Lockwood would write in 1960, in the foreword to a book about Wahoo. Fighting aggressively, taking the war to the enemy, showing no fear. When a natural leader and born daredevil such as Mush Morton is given command of a submarine, the result can only be a fighting ship of the highest order, with officers and men who would follow their skipper to the gates of hell. And they did. Lockwood wrote that 17 years after Morton's death, knowing full well what Harrison was now learning, that Morton's record was complicated, that the Buyo Maru incident had left a permanent stain, that the very aggressiveness Lockwood praised had led to the deaths of Allied prisoners of war. The broader context. Harrison stepped back and looked at the war itself, trying to understand how the Buyo Maru incident fit into the larger pattern. American submarine doctrine in 1942 had been cautious, almost timid. Submarines were told to avoid detection, to strike from distance, to escape before counterattack. The results had been poor. In the first year of the war, American submarines had sunk fewer than 200 Japanese vessels, far below expectations. Some captains had been relieved for being too cautious. The submarine force had been desperate for aggressive commanders, for men who would take risks, who would surface and engage the enemy, who would push deep into Japanese-controlled waters and strike hard targets. Morton had been exactly what they wanted. His first patrol had shown what aggressive tactics could achieve. His second patrol, despite the Buyo Maru incident, had reinforced that lesson. By mid-1943, Morton's approach was being taught to new submarine commanders. Get close, hit hard, don't hesitate, don't show mercy. The submarines were instruments of economic warfare, tasked with destroying Japan's merchant fleet and starving the island nation of the resources needed to continue fighting. Mercy meant Japanese ships delivering fuel, food, ammunition, troops. Mercy meant a longer war and more American deaths. But unrestricted submarine warfare had its own history, and it was not a clean one. In World War I, German U-boats had sunk merchant vessels without warning, killing thousands of civilians and neutral nationals. The practice had been condemned as barbaric and had contributed to America's entry into that war. After World War I, the international community had tried to impose rules on submarine warfare through the London Naval Treaty of 1930. Submarines were supposed to surface, stop vessels, allow crews to evacuate before sinking the ship. The rules were idealistic, and in practice, impossible to follow in total war. By 1942, both Germany and Japan had abandoned any pretense of following these rules, sinking merchant vessels without warning and often leaving survivors to die. The United States had formally adopted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan on December 7, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. The order was simple: sink enemy shipping on sight. No warnings, no rescue obligations. Total war. But even within that framework, there were supposed to be limits. You sank ships, not lifeboats. You destroyed vessels, not survivors. The line was theoretically clear, even if it was increasingly blurred in practice. The transformation in submarine warfare doctrine between 1942 and 1944 was remarkable in its speed and totality. In 2 years, American submarines went from cautious operation under prize rules to unrestricted attacks that sometimes included strafing survivors to prevent rescue. Commanders who in 1942 would have been court-martialed for such actions were by 1944 being decorated for them. The change reflected the broader brutalization of the Pacific War, the transformation of both American and Japanese forces from armies that theoretically followed civilized rules to forces that increasingly viewed the enemy as subhuman and undeserving of mercy. The confrontation with O'Kane. Harrison requested an interview with Richard O'Kane, who was now back in the United States after his repatriation from Japanese captivity. O'Kane was living in Northern California, recovering from his imprisonment, and at first declined the meeting. Harrison persisted, explaining that he was investigating the Buyo Maru incident for historical purposes, not for prosecution. In July 1946, O'Kane agreed to meet. They sat in O'Kane's living room on a hot afternoon, 2 naval officers in civilian clothes, talking about events 3.5 years past. O'Kane looked older than his 36 years, gaunt from his captivity, his eyes carrying the particular distance that Harrison had seen in many men who had spent time in Japanese prison camps. "I know why you're here," O'Kane said, when they had gotten through the preliminary courtesies. "You want to know about the Buyo Maru. You want me to tell you that Mush Morton was a war criminal, that we murdered Allied prisoners, that everything the Japanese said in their protest was true." He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "I can't tell you that. I won't tell you that. What I will tell you is what happened, exactly as I remember it, and you can make your own judgment." O'Kane described the patrol, the sinking of the transport, the surfacing to observe the results. "We saw the lifeboats right away," he said. 20 boats, maybe more. We could see they were full. Morton wanted to investigate, see if we could gather intelligence. maybe confirm the sinking for our records. We approached to about 800 yards. Then we started taking fire. I saw muzzle flashes from at least 2 boats. Small arms, rifles, maybe a light machine gun. The rounds weren't hitting us, but they were close enough. Morton made the call. He said they were hostile, they were combatants, and we were going to eliminate the threat. Did you see any indication that there were Allied prisoners in those boats? Harrison asked. O'Kane was quiet for a long moment. I saw men who didn't look Japanese, he finally said. Some had different uniforms. Some looked European, not Asian. I reported it to Morton. He said they must be Japanese nationals from the colonies, maybe some Koreans, maybe some Europeans working for the Japanese. He said it didn't matter. They were on an enemy transport. They were firing at us, and we had to protect the boat. Did any of them try to surrender? Harrison asked. Did you see white flags? Another long pause. Yes, O'Kane said quietly. After about 20 minutes, some of the boats raised white cloth. Morton said it was a trick, that the Japanese don't surrender, that they were trying to lure us closer for a better shot. He ordered the gun crews to keep firing. We went down the line, boat by boat. It took over an hour. By the end, there was no more resistance. There was no more anything. Just wreckage and bodies. How did you feel about that? Harrison asked. O'Kane stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. I felt like I was doing my job, he said. I felt like we were at war, and the enemy had shot at us and we had returned fire. I felt like Morton was protecting his crew and his boat, but I also felt... He trailed off, then continued. I also felt like we had crossed a line. I couldn't identify it then. I can identify it now, after everything that's happened, after being a prisoner myself, after seeing what the Japanese did to us. We crossed from fighting soldiers to killing survivors, from military action to massacre. Morton believed he was doing the right thing. He believed those men would be rescued and would fight again. He believed showing mercy would cost American lives. Maybe he was right. Maybe those Indian and Australian prisoners, if they had survived, would have eventually been forced to work for the Japanese war effort. Maybe Morton saved American lives by killing them. I don't know. What I know is that I stood on that bridge and I helped direct fire into lifeboats. And some of the men who died were allies. And I will carry that until the day I die. Would you testify to this? Harrison asked. If there was an investigation? O'Kane shook his head. Mush Morton is dead. He died fighting for his country. He was one of the bravest men I ever served with, and one of the most aggressive submarine commanders in the Navy. What happened at the Buyo Maru was wrong. I believe that now. But I will not destroy his memory. The war is over. Let the dead rest. Find your answers somewhere else. The final irony. Harrison wrote his report in August 1946. He documented everything he had found, every statement, every record, every piece of evidence. He concluded that Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton had, on January 26, 1943, ordered his crew to fire upon survivors of a sunken vessel in lifeboats, resulting in the deaths of approximately 74 Allied prisoners of war and an estimated 300 to 400 Japanese military personnel. He concluded that this action violated the Hague Convention of 1907 and the laws of war as understood by the United States Navy. He concluded that Morton's official report of the incident had been incomplete and had omitted key details about the nature and duration of the engagement. He concluded that the Navy's investigation in 1943 had been cursory and had failed to uncover evidence that was readily available in crew statements and ammunition logs. He also concluded that prosecuting Morton posthumously would serve no purpose. That the Buyo Maru incident had occurred in the context of total war and unrestricted submarine warfare doctrine, that many of the factors that led to the incident were systemic rather than individual, and that attempting to single out Morton for an action that reflected broader problems with American submarine warfare policy would be unjust and would damage morale in the submarine service. He recommended that the incident be documented for historical purposes, but that no formal action be taken against Morton's memory or his surviving crew members. The report was classified secret and filed. Admiral Lockwood, when he reviewed it, attached a brief note. Lieutenant Commander Harrison's investigation was thorough and his findings are disturbing. However, I concur with his recommendation for no action. Morton was a warrior who fought aggressively in defense of his country. The circumstances of January 1943 were complex, and the fog of war was thick. We honor Morton's memory and the memory of all who died aboard Wahoo. This matter is closed. The matter was not closed. In 1959, the Navy named a destroyer after Dudley Morton, USS Morton, DD 948, a Forrest Sherman-class destroyer, commissioned with ceremony and pride. Morton's family attended. His widow spoke about his bravery and dedication. Admiral Lockwood, now retired, gave a speech praising Morton as one of the greatest submarine commanders in American history. No one mentioned the Buyo Maru. The classified report remained in Navy archives, unknown to the public, unacknowledged by official history. The museum present day. The USS Bowfin Submarine Museum and Park, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A group of visitors stands before a display dedicated to the submarine war in the Pacific. The display includes photographs of submarine commanders, including one of Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, smiling in his dress uniform, his Navy Cross visible on his chest. The caption reads, Dudley Mush Morton, commanding officer of USS Wahoo, one of the most successful submarine commanders of World War II. Credited with 19 enemy vessels sunk, lost with Wahoo in October 1943. A teenager asks the tour guide, was he really famous? The guide, a retired Navy chief, nods. One of the most aggressive commanders we had. Took the fight to the enemy. His tactics revolutionized submarine warfare. Did he kill a lot of people? The teenager asks. The guide pauses, choosing his words carefully. War is terrible. Submarines in World War II sank hundreds of ships, killed thousands of enemy soldiers and sailors. Morton was very good at his job. He was also very brave. He died doing what he believed was right, fighting for his country. What the guide doesn't mention, because he doesn't know, is that in a classified file in a Navy archive in Washington, there exists a report documenting how Morton's most controversial action, the one that almost ended his career, involved the deaths of 74 Allied prisoners of war. He doesn't know that several of Morton's own crew members wrote letters expressing distress and moral uncertainty about that action. He doesn't know that Morton's executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who later became one of the most decorated submariners in American history, believed until his death in 1994 that they had crossed a line on January 26, 1943. The teenager nods and moves on to the next display. The photograph of Morton remains on the wall, smiling, decorated, honored. The truth remains in the archives, known to a few historians, unknown to the public. A reminder that war transforms not just tactics and technologies, but the very boundaries of what soldiers are willing to do and what societies are willing to honor. The line between military necessity and war crime, between aggressive tactics and atrocity, between heroism and murder, is sometimes thinner than we want to believe. And sometimes, when the fog of war finally clears, we find that the heroes we celebrated were also the perpetrators of acts we would condemn, if only we knew about them, if only we looked closely enough, if only we were willing to see our own history complete and unvarnished. Morton's story ended in Soya Strait on October 11, 1943, when Japanese depth charges found their mark and sent Wahoo and 88 men to the bottom. But the story of what he did, what he ordered, what resulted from his moment of decision in the waters off the Caroline Islands continues. It continues in classified reports and historical footnotes, in the memories of surviving crew members who carried the burden of that day to their graves, in the names on casualty lists of Allied prisoners who survived captivity only to be killed by friendly fire, in the questions that remain unanswered about how far military necessity justifies, and about what kind of wars we fight, and what kind of people we become when we fight them. The Buyo Maru incident, which seemed to Morton at the time a justified military action against hostile survivors who had fired upon his submarine, actually represented something far more troubling. The moment when American submarine warfare fully embraced the logic of total war, when the old rules finally shattered completely, when the transformation from naval officer to unrestricted warrior became complete. Morton led that transformation. He paid for it with his life 9 months later. The 74 Allied prisoners paid for it earlier, dying in the water under American fire. Their names largely forgotten by history, their deaths classified and minimized and explained away by the very forces that killed them. That is the terrible mathematics of war. Sometimes the heroes and the killers are the same people, and sometimes we honor the one while trying desperately to forget the other.